Thank you all for attending my final speech today. It'll be on the Vietnam-era women waging war. The Vietnam War derived from the conflicts of communism between a divided nation. As the result of the battling Viet Cong in support of North Vietnam and the democratic South Vietnam, the 20-year-long war proved to be ruthless in its casualty rates. But the unknown soldiers behind the lines fueled that raging war. And who were these unknown vigilantes? Women. Women carried out many different duties during the war for both the United States and Vietnam alike. Straying outside their traditional domestic spherical limits, women actually joined in on the lines of combat. Have you ever stepped outside your comfort zone in order to do what you believed to do was right? After speaking with a former soldier of the Vietnam War about his personal experiences, he spoke of the dramatic differences that these women overseas had on those troops. And no matter the overall outcome of that war, I found that women played a very vital key in the war efforts. Today I will be discussing the war efforts of the American women in their roles, Vietnamese women in their roles, and the afterlife of the war. Specifically, I will be talking about the nursing and more traditional roles that the American women played, the combative and outlandish duties that these Vietnamese women held out, as well as the afterlife and memories that these women took back with them. American women represented their country throughout each of the military branches, as well as outside organizations in support of those troops. Although there were many reasons as to why these women joined the war effort during the Vietnam era, no woman was ever drafted into the war. All were voluntary, and although they didn't have a say in what their jobs and duties would entail, many were happy to represent their country, serving as a way to prove to themselves, their families, and their country, as well as a way to challenge themselves in their careers and the military rankings. Nurses served in hospitals for all military branches, which meant on ships, airlifts, as well as the field work. These women were up against wounds that they had never seen before and diseases that were foreign to their knowledge. Lieutenant Moore was one of the many women that served in the military service during the war. And this is a brief documentation of her experience during the war.
Prior to graduating from nursing school, Grace Moore, formerly Grace Lillig from Dewar, Iowa, made a 2-year commitment to the Army. Halfway through her hitch, she received orders for Vietnam.
I'm like, okay, thank you, and hung up. And I chain smoked almost a whole pack of cigarettes before I had nerve enough to call home. I didn't even call my mother, I called my sister. And I said to her, don't tell Mom. She goes, don't tell Mom what? I'm like, just don't tell Mom, don't tell Mom. And she said, don't tell her what? I said, I'm going to Vietnam. And she says, well, what am I supposed to tell her? You fell off the edge of the earth?
More than 7,500 U.S. women served in Vietnam. 85% were nurses, and 8 died serving their country. Lieutenant Moore was assigned to the 12th Evacuation Hospital at Cu Chi, where some of the bloodiest fighting of the war took place. Eventually, she became head nurse of the orthopedic ward.
You tried your best to distract, to help. We wore eye makeup because we just felt like that was something that would be uplifting to these young people. In the morning, we'd get up in Vietnam at 120 degrees and put on mascara. That kind of stuff, those little things like that,
For Moore, the stress of Vietnam bubbled to the surface only once, when she learned a friend had been wounded and was en route to Cu Chi for treatment.
And so I didn't get to see him until he came out of x-ray and he was burned. Not severely. He wasn't even admitted to the hospital. He was treated and sent back to his unit. But he was the first person that I knew. I mean, I knew this person, not just as a soldier, I knew him as a person. And that was the first time I cried in Vietnam. I went outside behind the Quonset hut and I vomited and I bawled. And I think that was the only time that I remember really crying.
During her 7-month tour of duty, Moore felt like she was working on an assembly line because patients stayed on her ward for no more than 3 days.
The wounds were just horrific. We didn't close them, so the wounds would be open and you would change the dressings 2 or 3 times a day because they would drain, but you couldn't close them because when the guys came into the ER, they might have pieces of rocks, shrapnel, dirt, leaves, their uniform in their wounds, blown into the wounds, and if you would close that, it was like a perfect medium for bacteria to grow, and they would get horrible infections. So the wounds were left open, so you were constantly changing dressings, giving pain medicine, typical things.
Moore quickly developed strategies to help her cope with the horrors of war.
They call it psychic numbing, and it's something you don't consciously do. It's just your body's way of protecting yourself from what you have to do and how you would feel. So your feelings are they're just kind of, you don't have feelings when you're working because we were busy. And when somebody asks you years later, how did you do that? You're like, I don't know. I just did. I quit going to church. I had no faith. I lost everything. It was a bad time with lots of casualties that, you can't fix them. You can't fix them. You can only help. And I'm like, nah, my God wouldn't do this. So I said, I'm done with you. And I didn't start going back to church until after I got back from Vietnam.
Because many of these American women sought to fulfill their duties to their country, they were presented with opportunities besides just the role as nursing. History.com recalls that although the variety of roles served by women were more traditionally secretarial and clerical, they also took on positions and jobs such as physicians and air traffic controllers, as well as intelligence officers. Nonetheless, nothing would prepare these women for the sights that they would endure during their duty of tour. Vietnamese and American women played both similar and very different roles in the war. Even though Vietnam was a divided country at the time, women from both North and South Vietnam strived to gain what little freedom and independence they could. Just as most women across the world, Vietnamese women before the war stuck to their more motherly intuition and domestic caretaking responsibilities. Primarily taking care of the family and children, they also took on jobs such as working in factories and the fields with rice paddies, as well as clerical jobs. But the Vietnam War brought forth a new opportunity at crushing those former traditional roles that they had played. Along with those household duties, these women took on responsibilities that supported their countries in the war effort. They took on jobs such as providing these soldiers with food and health care, and at times participated in the hand-to-hand combat action alongside their counterparts. Women of the Cong and democratic Vietnam weren't always full aware of the goals the United States had in store, but only focused on helping their own countries. Some loyalists even used their combat training skills to be the ultimate guerrilla fighters. These guerrilla fighters chose unconventional and ambush warfare tactics in order to overtake their enemies. As you can see in this picture, the women were equipped with weaponry that could cause massive bloodshed. Vietnam as a whole country differed immensely from the United States in the way that they applied their women to their warfare. While the South Vietnamese women allied with American soldiers, some volunteered their own army in hopes to bring down the rebelling Cong. During this time, the Vietnam War was very frowned upon, and the homecoming seemed a little less enthusiastic compared to past wars. Yet the life for both groups of women went back to how they were before the war even started. American women went back to their traditional roles as secretaries, household keepers, and even a handful of their nursing jobs followed them back here to the United States. Vietnow.com shared that some women even came back to civilian life and joined the organizations such as Red Cross and other philanthropy groups that helped warfare efforts and benefit us still to this day. Vietnamese women alike continued their livelihoods in a way that contradicted their violent work in the war. The true experiences and memories that all these women carry with them after the war is quite incredible. This brief video is a personal memoir of one American woman that was sent to the 20-year-long gruesome war.
I remember the intensity of it. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was a time of extremes. There was horror and death, and then there was great joy. But those who were alive, it was a celebration of being alive. I feel like I left part of myself there. And at the same time, I brought away from there a strength that I would never have had I not gone. My job was to keep up the morale of the troops. We took with us sort of like game shows that we had made up. It was absolutely amazing to me how much fun men and war get out of silly games. I carried a guitar, and sometimes we would just sit around and sing, sometimes we would just sit around and talk. One time they asked us if we'd go down the road and see some guys that had lost some guys, and the morale was pretty low, and of course we'd go anywhere that they wanted us to. And they were pretty far out. And I remember getting out of the Jeep and just walking there digging foxholes, filling sandbags, and we just go walking over there in our little blue uniforms, and the reaction was sort of, and for a few minutes that 1,000-yard stare was focused on home. And I knew I made a difference. Wherever we could fit in, whatever they needed, whatever we could do, that's what we tried to do.
The Vietnam Vietnam War brought women into the militia world and gave them a voice that they had never received before. American women became the health caretakers and the vital role of survival for some of the injured soldiers, as Vietnamese women exchanged their domestic roles for a more violent and hands-on effort at war. All while after the war, the lives of women from both sides went back to tradition. The effects that these women had on history and on their own countries was outstanding. The new groups that were formed in order to better troops and civilians are still here to this day. History is always bound to repeat itself, but thanks to these veteran women who have fought and partook in the war and history, we've been able to further ourselves to better protect our countries and the people residing in it. Thank you.